Thanks very much for the kind introduction. As was mentioned earlier, I had published a book in 1992 called Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland. That is now more than 20 years ago. And so, in effect, what I'm trying to do today is kind of revisit and look at some of the questions that that book raised and to deal with some of the responses to it and some more recent kinds of developments. Certainly, one question that hovers over the Holocaust and in a sense is inescapable for anyone who is studying it is that very basic question, why did they kill? How do we explain the motivation of human beings who engaged in these frightful activities? Part of the problem in trying to come up with a coherent explanation is, of course, that perpetrators came in so many different shapes and forms. There is no single archetypal perpetrator. And in fact, I generally talk about 4 different rough groups. These obviously are my own constructs, but I think I try to show you, since the diversity of the ways in which people participated. Certainly one group we're very familiar with, and these are the ideological killers. Those who zealously participate because they believe what they're doing is necessary and good. They accept an ideology that demonized the Jews and made the elimination of Jews a necessary historical act. And that here we have a fairly clear case in which belief produces action. These people believed that Jews were a terrible danger and that to eliminate that danger, any means were sufficient, including that of total and systematic mass murder. That clearly includes people like Hitler and Himmler and Heydrich and the people at the top, and no small number of ardent true believers in the Nazi cause and in Hitler's racist ideology. There's a second group that was also very important, and they're what I call the experts. After the war, these people tried to portray themselves as totally non-political, as simply having lent their expertise to the Nazi regime, as any good patriotic citizen must do. And this included the generals and the officers of the German army, who after the war, of course, not only said they were totally apolitical, but in virtually all of their memoirs made 3 assertions. All the defeats were caused by Hitler's mistakes, all the victories belonged to their own military genius, and all the atrocities were committed by the SS. We know all of those propositions to be false, but they are pervasive in the post-war memoirs of the German generals. German industrialists that managed to keep the German army armed and in the field, and people like Albert Speer, who of course managed the army, the munitions and military economy in the last years, is in fact perhaps the paradigmatic example of the allegedly unpolitical expert who after the war said, of course, he was simply naive and uninformed. He had no idea the wider implications and ramifications of Hitler and the regime, but he did what he could to do his little job based upon his abilities to organize the economy for war. Third, we know now, of course, that in fact expertise and political ideology are not mutually exclusive. One could be one of these experts and be indeed have many ideas that overlapped with the Nazis. Most of the generals shared many of the beliefs of the Nazi regime, particularly the entitlement to empire in Eastern Europe, to rule over what they considered the inferior populations there, to accept the equation between Jews and Bolsheviks. These were common property of much of the military as well as the Nazis. And we know, of course, that Albert Speer's feigning political naivete was a very well acted sort of scenario that he played out. But the more we learn about his own operations, the less persuasive that becomes. A third area would be the people I refer to as sort of the middle and lower echelon bureaucrats, the people that staffed the government of Nazi Germany and many of the agencies that helped it to run. And this would involve all sorts of people, whether it would be the clerk in the trains off in the German trains that carried out charters. One day they may be chartering workers' vacations to the Alps or the Baltic. The next day they may be chartering one-way trains to Auschwitz. And by the same procedures of other charter trains, they would have one-way group rates, children between 4 and 10 at half price, and thank you very much, children under 4 shipped to Auschwitz free of charge, all according to the standard operating procedures of how Germans ran charter trains. It could be the mayors of any particular town in Germany. In the day they were told to basically assemble Jews, mobilize virtually the entire staff of the town to collect the keys of apartments, collect the workbooks of people, collect their ration books, carry out the searches, shut off usually one whole train station where people would be gathered, pay overtime to the cleaning maids at the police station to do the strip searches of the females. All of this for one train would require a vast operation in which all sorts of middle and lower level state employees, government, city employees would be involved to make things work. And then finally, I would say there's a fourth group, sort of the grassroots killers, those who at the end of this whole process were the ones who had the actual face-to-face job of killing. Obviously, much of the administrative machinery of destruction, to use Raoul Hilberg's term, involved all sorts of people who never saw a Jew, never beat a Jew, never pulled a trigger, never shoved anybody into a gas chamber, but all performed all sorts of duties that were essential to bring the victim to the killer or bring the killer to the victim. But in the end, you had to have people who actually carried out the killing and carried it out in a face-to-face way. And it is that group that I wanted to talk about today, to talk a bit more about how we try to assess why they behaved the way that they did, how was it possible to mobilize so many people to engage in mass killing over such an extended period of time, and to not run into backlash, not run into dragging of feet, not run into ways in which often government programs can be silently sabotaged by people who vote with their feet and go someplace else, do something different. Certainly for the ordinary killers or the grassroots killers, we know, of course, they are not just SS men. We're now talking of people who were in the Wehrmacht, people who were in the order police, reservists, middle-aged men who were drafted into the order police, not as professional policemen, but simply because they were too old for the German army and would be given what were thought to be rather benign behind-the-front jobs that turned out to be anything but benign. And of course, we also know now a whole enlistment of vast numbers of collaborators in the occupied countries that also became involved in the rounding up and in the killing process. Now, the categories that I've given you are, as I say, I think useful as rough guidelines. Obviously, they are not strict separations between these groups, but I think it helps us to understand the diversity of activities, the different ways in which people engaged and participated in the machinery of destruction, so that when I talk about the particular group, the grassroots killers, we do realize that there were many other people and many other ways in which people could participate as well. Well, certainly in the immediate post-war period, when those who were being rounded up, arrested, investigated, some of them even being put on trial, the standard response from the arrested suspects themselves to the question, why did they kill, was almost always a uniform, I had to obey orders. If I hadn't obeyed orders, I would have suffered draconic punishment myself. This, of course, that is obedience, coercion, to avoid draconic punishment for oneself, was a way of implying that they had neither legal nor moral responsibility for their actions. It is the people that coerce them that are the guilty party, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, all conveniently dead, but that those who actually pulled the trigger, who actually carried out the face-to-face killing in this mode of explanation, basically were not moral agents acting on their own, but were simply objects of coercion that shifts the responsibility elsewhere. The problem with that approach, of course, is that in the many decades after World War II, in which whole cadres of German defense lawyers, at one trial after another, have never been able to find one single documentable case in which anyone who refused to shoot unarmed civilians suffered any kind of draconic punishment. This is a myth. This was simply a myth that was spread as a standard post-war alibi or defense that has no basis in anything that we can document from evidence. The fallback from that position was putative duress. And this is the second line that German defense attorneys for their accused clients would employ. Well, maybe it is true that their client would not have suffered draconic punishment, but how could they have known it at the time? Who were they to dare to test the limit and to find out? They thought they would have suffered. Clearly, in a repressive regime like the Nazis, it is not a flight of fancy to imagine that if you refused an order, whether it be in the police or the army, that there would be bad consequences for that. That is why the case of Reserve Police Battalion 101 as a case study has become so pivotal. Because on the first day before the first massacre took place with his unit, as the commander of that unit, a man named Major Tropp, assembled his men outside the Polish village of Józefów on the early morning of July 13th, 1942, he gave his men a brief speech. And the witnesses of this are fairly consistent, that his voice was choking, he had tears streaming down his cheeks, he was clearly having difficulty controlling himself. And he told his men that they had a terrible task, a frightful task, something he never would have asked them to do on his own, but these were orders from above. And then to make what he was going to ask them to do more sensible, he said, keep in mind that the bombs are falling on women and children in Germany. They're killing our non-combatants, therefore we can kill theirs. That the Jews were in league with the partisans to give a military rationale, and so on and so forth. And then at the end he explained they were going to round up the Jews in this village, take them to the forest, and execute them. And he concluded his talk with the offer that if any of the older men among you, this was a middle-aged battalion of reservists, do not feel up to it, please step out. And anyone who had the courage at that point to step forward could turn in their rifle and be excused from the executions. He made it very clear no one was going to be forced to kill that day. And that remained the basic principle of the battalion over the next months, that officers and non-commissioned officers knew they could not force men or threaten men. The men knew they couldn't be threatened and coerced, and that no one in this battalion had to kill. There is no putative duress. And because of that, then the men had to explain their actions in a very lengthy pretrial court investigation in ways that were much more truthful. You don't get the systematic mendacity that characterizes so many German trials and pretrial investigations without being able to claim coercion or putative duress. They actually had to talk much more frankly about what they did. And between the lines, we can, I think, be able to also figure out, why, out of what they said, why they did what they did. So that became, in a sense, a key case that was going to dispatch with, once and for all, the issues of duress and putative duress.
Many people say no. Did anyone say no?
At that point, initially a dozen men did step out, and then over that day, and then over later days, I estimated that close to 20% of the battalion became, quote, non-shooters, that they would not engage in actual killing. And we'll get back to that issue of what percentage of a killing unit, in fact, didn't kill in a bit. But thank you. That's for eliciting that point. A second explanation, not done so much by the German perpetrators, but by puzzled American psychologists in the post-war period, was to try to find out what kind of psychological profile these people had that would allow such abnormal or such aberrant behavior. It seems self-evident to people in the immediate post-war period, with all of the stories by survivors and all the documents they were discovering, that people had done things that were simply unimaginable. Clearly, ordinary, normal people couldn't behave this way. These people had to be psychotic, they had to be pathological, there had to be something very abnormal about them. The problem was that for most all of these people under investigation, in the pre-war period, they had been perfectly law-abiding model citizens. In the post-war period, they had, again, an exemplary life insofar as time passed after the war, before they were discovered. It was only in the period of Nazi rule, when they were sent to Eastern Europe, that they behaved in this particularly aberrant and pathological way. So that the means or the method by which psychologists try to explain this temporary pathological aberration was to develop the notion of the authoritarian personality. That certain people, they hypothesized, have so-called sleeper traits, certain characteristics that are dormant most of the time, but in the environment of a totalitarian regime, and of course this is post-45, so it was okay now to talk about both Stalin and Hitler, since we had fought one and we're now ready to fight the other. And you could talk about the totalitarian temptation, in which certain people have certain characteristics that draw them to a totalitarian regime, that make them self-select, to volunteer for, and to basically prosper, rise, by doing the kinds of things that a totalitarian regime needs done. And so that therefore these sleeper traits become awakened, they become activated, and a certain group of perpetrators of totalitarianism emerge in the atmosphere of Nazism or Stalinism. If those regimes fall, as the Nazi regime did, that atmosphere disappears, and they revert back. Their sleeper traits go to sleep again, and they revert back to their seeming, but we now know, hidden, not real normality. At least that was the hypothesis of the authoritarian personality. The problem with that is that the more research we did, and certainly the pioneer in this regard was Raoul Hilberg, in a sense pointing out how many different ways people participated, and how randomly people came to this, and the degree to which whole units were assigned, in which there's no process of self-selection, in which simply groups are involved that are cross-section of society, that this whole hypothesis simply could not stand up to the increasing empirical evidence that we gathered about how the Holocaust was implemented and where the grassroots killers had come from and what path they had followed to become Holocaust killers. A third explanation was one, well, if these people individually are not abnormal, maybe the whole culture of Germany is abnormal, and they're the products of an abnormal society and an abnormal culture. And this explanation, I think, went through sort of two versions. In the immediate post-war period, it was to harken back to Germany as a product of Prussianism and militarism, and that the German state, in effect, was created by and around the Prussian army. The ethos of the Prussian army, with its militarism and its doctrines of discipline, obedience, permeated German society. Therefore, democratic habits did not flourish. Germany became an illiberal society in comparison to the supposedly normal development of France, England, and the United States. Germany had gotten off the track, had followed its own special path. The German word for that was Sonderweg, to become a modern industrial society, but not a modern democracy, in which basically they didn't develop a democratic political culture commensurate with the other modern social economic changes that were taking place in Germany. And that therefore these people could be mobilized in ways that people in normal democratic societies or modern societies could not be. This view, I think, which is sort of the national character argument, I think rather, again, failed to stand up against increasing empirical evidence. It was too reminiscent, I think, of much of the wartime propaganda as well. But certainly as one got a better sense of the alternative paths and the different strands of German political culture. It had the largest socialist party in Europe before in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It had various attempts at democratization, 1848 and 1918, that for one reason or another were thwarted. But to portray Germans as kind of in goose-step, lockstep as a political culture was one that did not remain, I think, compelling or persuasive. Particularly after Germany adapted to democratization so quickly after World War II, that what hadn't succeeded earlier did succeed in the 50s and 60s and 70s. A second variant on this was the one that was offered by Daniel Goldhagen in his book Hitler's Willing Executioners that appeared 4 years after my book Ordinary Men did. And that is to say, German culture was characterized by a particular kind of anti-Semitism, different from the pervasive anti-Semitism that was spread throughout the rest of Europe. And his term for this was a eliminationist anti-Semitism, that other anti-Semitisms discriminated against Jews, but the eliminationist anti-Semitism of German culture yearned to exterminate the Jews. And that in the end, in effect, what Hitler did is he, again, use his language, simply unshackled, unleashed the Germans to do what they long wanted to do because they'd been programmed by their culture. They had no other way of looking at this issue because elimination anti-Semitism so pervaded the culture that they couldn't think otherwise. And that this was simply the way people grew up in Germany. It was kind of a cultural determinism argument. Again, this is an argument that historians, for the most part, not all, but most, I don't think have accepted. I would quote one of my professors at the University of Wisconsin, the very renowned George Mossa, who used to tell the story that if in 1900 someone had predicted that within 50 years all the Jews of Europe would be murdered, the answer would have been, well, I suppose that's possible. Those French or Russians are capable of anything. No one would have said Germany in 1900 was the predestined country to kill the Jews of Europe. If you were a Jew in the Ukraine, where did you want to go in the late 19th century? You wanted to get to the United States, or you wanted to get to Germany? Germany, when Europe, was the land of golden opportunity, the land where Jews rose higher and had more social mobility, were more integrated in society than any other European country. So to view Germany as the country, to use Daniel Goldhagen's phrase, that was pregnant with genocide, I think is hindsight history. It's to read backwards into Germany just what will explain Auschwitz, but to ignore all other factors. And historians who do their history backwards generally are going to go amiss. At least that is what I would argue. Well, if, in fact, we aren't going to get anywhere with duress or putative duress, with authoritarian personality, with eliminationist anti-Semitism, what other kinds of approaches can one take? And I would argue that we have to take an approach that goes beyond looking for the abnormal individual or the abnormal culture. And that we have to accept that something happened here that was part of human nature, that was part of the potential of what ordinary or normal people can do in certain historical circumstances, and to look more to aspects of human nature on the one hand, and to understand that most of the participation in the Holocaust is a group activity. We have to look at the dynamics of how groups interact, how people in groups interact. This is not a bunch of serial killers on their own. This is a program organized by the German government and carried out by people acting in concert. And we do have to understand what are the dynamics of people who are working together as groups. And that this approach, in a sense, is one that is more situational, more organizational, more institutional. And the approach is not so much looking at psychology, assuming there's a pathology to be found, but social psychology to assume that group dynamics are one of the keys that we have to understand. In fact, if one looks back, we can see that in the 1950s and 60s, there were three very path-breaking approaches taken by social psychologists. Not looking at individuals, but as I say, looking at how groups interact and how people behave in a group environment. that were consciously at that time, I think, seen as relevant to the committing of atrocities. And then they kind of fell off the stage for a long time. And I included mention of them in the conclusion of my book because I thought this did need to be brought to bear more consciously on our understanding of perpetrator behavior, and particularly understanding the dynamics of a killer battalion like Reserve Police Battalion 101. The first of these is often referred to as the Ash experiment or the conformity experiment. The format of this is, and I should say before I start, these early experiments generally would not meet the requirements of informed consent for such experiments today. They involve an unwitting subject who in fact is going to be pivotal in this. So central to the Ash experiment is you have an unwitting subject that is brought into a classroom format with many other students, and there's a professor at the front of the room who has the authority of being the professor. And he either draws 4 lines on the blackboard, one of which is easily recognizably shorter than the others, or lays out 4 strings, but basically he sets up something where you have a situation where it's very easy for anybody to identify which is the piece that doesn't belong. And then he goes around the room, and of course he starts with all the others that are Confederates in the experiment, asks them which is the shortest line. And they all invariably choose the wrong one. This is very intended to do this. And by the time you finally come to our unwitting subject and ask him or her, well, which is the shortest line, that person, not all the time, but in the vast preponderance of time, will answer what everyone else has said, that they will prefer to conform to the group and not confront the others, which involves basically telling them all that they're incredibly stupid or can't see. It's much easier to go along and avoid that kind of confrontation. And we can see from this that avoiding confrontation with the norms of the people around you and avoiding challenging them does shape the way people interact with others. Conformity is one of the things that shapes group behavior. A second experiment is the so-called Milgram experiment, or the obedience to authority experiment. And this was done by Stanley Milgram at Yale in the 1960s. And I prefer to call it the deference to authority as opposed to obedience to authority experiment, because I really think what we have is a deference to authority, not obeying of orders or laws. But the format of the experiment was that Milgram advertised for volunteers to come to participate in the experiment. And if they did, they'd receive $10 as their sort of fee. And people lined up outside the laboratory and were brought in pairs. And once again, one of that pair is an unwitting subject, and the other is an actor who is going to play out a certain role, unbeknownst to the unwitting subject. And they're greeted by a scientist in a white lab coat with a clipboard, all of the visual symbols of scientific authority, just like the professor in the classroom. If the professor is presiding over these people and isn't stopping these people from giving the wrong answer, well, who are they, the individual, to challenge it? Here again, you have an authority figure. And the scientist explains this is a learning experiment, how pain relates to learning, and that it's very important that once you start, that you go through with it so you don't destroy all the accumulated results, that the person can be assured that there will be no permanent damage, and the scientist takes all responsibility for this on himself. At which point they then flip a coin, and of course the Confederate actor loses the flip and is strapped into a chair and hooked up to electrodes. And the unwitting subject is taken to a control panel where there are a series of switches or buttons, and above that are labeled the voltage that each will inflict, 15, 30, 45, 60, all the way up to 450. And then with various descriptions, minor, moderate, medium, severe, dangerous, XXX. Then there are several number of variations on how this is run. The standard variation, or I should say the 2 key variations, are the one in which the man at the panel, who will be the teacher, will read out pairs of words, and then is supposed to read out one of each pair, and the poor man strapped in the chair, hooked up to electrodes, is to give the corresponding word that goes with it. And every time he fails to give a correct answer, he's to get a zap of electricity. Does pain enhance learning? That's the disguise of the experiment. Now, one variation is to give no instruction as to how much pain is to be inflicted. And it turns out almost everybody, when left to decide themselves, if they had to inflict a shock, but they could decide how much to inflict, would give one, the lowest or second to lowest. That it would be, nobody wanted to be a sadist. Nobody wanted a chance to shoot somebody through electricity. And so they would sit there and toggle between 15 and 30 volts, and the experiment would run its course. The alternative to that, of course, was the experiment where the man at the control panel is instructed to move up the panel with each missed answer. From 15 to 30 to 45 to 60, how far will they go? And, of course, the man strapped in the chair has a well-rehearsed response to this. At each, as the shocks go up, he will begin to say, "Ouch! Stop it! This is painful! I have a heart condition! Please let me out!" Scream, and then fall silent. And it was all so there'd be a standard response for everybody who went through this. And Milgram found that roughly 2/3 of the people in this experiment would go all the way up into the danger zone for no other reason than somebody in a white coat with a clipboard who had paid them $10, told them they were contracted to do it and obligated to keep going because science depended upon this. They usually sweated profusely. They bit their lip. They were terribly nervous. They sometimes look and ask the scientists, "Are you sure everything is okay?" And they'd be assured, "Please go on." But they would go on. Not because they enjoyed it, not because they liked it, but because they were deferring to the authority of the scientist who was assuring them they should and must, in fact, continue. A third experiment, this again I said, would show us just how deference to authority, particularly when you have kind of contracted in, you've accepted whether you're in an army uniform or you've become part of an experiment working for a scientist, when you've taken on that position, it's very difficult to break out of that. A third experiment involves role adaptation. It's referred to as either the Zimbardo experiment or the Stanford prison experiment. In this case, Zimbardo, a Stanford social psychologist, called for volunteers again. And out of the pool that volunteered, he administered to them a whole series of psychological tests, what were the cutting-edge personality tests of the 1960s, to eliminate anybody that was in any significant way off the mean in any of these tests, to get as close to a common pool of normal people as any psychological instrument could devise at that time, including the so-called authoritarian personality test. Then they did do a random coin flip or drawing of straws, and 12 people were selected to be prison guards, and 12 people were selected to be prisoners. And in this simulation, in fact, people are rounded up in their homes, dragged off to the prison, dressed in little hospital gowns where you're naked in the butt and feel terribly vulnerable. And the prison guards are dressed in snazzy uniforms with high boots and sunglasses, so you can't even look them in the eye. And all of this is arranged to create both a huge disparity, of course, between the prisoner and the guard, and to demarcate the very different roles that they will have. And Zimbardo thought this could run for 2 weeks. The prison guards are instructed that they cannot hit or physically, hurt the prisoners, but anything else they do to gain domination, to gain control over the prisoners is okay. And the hook, of course, is the prisoners there all the time, but the guards rotate, so the guards are always outnumbered. There are usually 3 guards on duty who have to control 12 prisoners. And the question is, what kinds of things would they do to secure their power over the prisoner community? How quickly would they adapt to the role of being a prison guard? And one, he found out they adapt very quickly. He called the experiment off after 1 week because it was spinning out of control. And the other key thing he found, I think, is basically the spectrum of role adaptation on the part of the guards. A small cohort emerged as the extremely zealous, extremely inventive people who endlessly found new ways to torment their prisoners, to assert their authority, to rule over the prisoners as if they really were the lords and masters. There was a middle group that followed kind of standard operating procedure. That is, they would look at the book and say, we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to do that, and they would play the role of, what do you have to do to be a good guard? What's required of me? What's my responsibility to play out my obligation to be a guard in this prison? And then, because they were hidden cameras, we know that they were, quote, two good guards. Guards who, when they thought no one else was looking, and didn't, of course, know they were being captured on camera, would do little acts of mitigation and kindness for the prisoners, though never at the expense of confronting their fellow guards or telling them this was a terrible thing that they were doing. But on their own, in hidden moments, would try to be decent human beings despite the role that they were playing. And so here again, I think we see both the importance of adaptation to roles, people adapting to what is expected of them, what is prescribed for them, and the spectrum of response. That not all, but some people under these circumstances become extremely enthusiastic, identify with and carry out those activities in the most ingenious, creative ways that they can, that they become little monsters in these circumstances. Now that was the situation in the 50s and 60s, and then after my book came out, and there were several other things that emerged, particularly as the social psychologists began to say, well, maybe we have yet more to say on this topic. In fact, one book that came out the very same year as Ordinary Men, so they couldn't cite me and I couldn't cite them because we were publishing simultaneously, was the book by Hamilton and Kelman called Crimes of Obedience. And one of the key important facts of this book is it was not about the Holocaust. It was about Americans in Vietnam. So here was a chance to look at a cross-cultural situation in which the issue of German culture, German anti-Semitism of any form is totally irrelevant, though racism obviously is not, and to look at why and in what ways did Americans in Vietnam comply with what Hamilton and Kelman thought were criminal orders. How do you explain My Lai and other such actions? And what they said in the course of their investigation was that there were sort of three ways in which people comply with criminal orders. One group were the true believers, those that not only accepted the order given, but embraced and identified with the cause behind that order. That basically they were ideological about this, that what the order was trying to accomplish, destroying communism in Vietnam, was a cause they were deeply committed to, and any means then become justified in doing that. And that they are the true believers, they are the ideological warriors in this. A second group were those who basically complied out of role adaptation. They weren't so much concerned with what the content of the orders were, but they were concerned with what is expected of a man who puts on the uniform of the American Army. What do I have to do to be a good soldier? And while they could recognize that these things they were doing, they would never do in their private life on their own, they could do as an American soldier wearing a uniform in war in compliance with the orders of their superiors. So they could be left to operate unsupervised. They didn't have to believe in the cause. They didn't have to accept their obligations and their duties to be a good soldier, and you could turn them loose and they would carry out these orders even if they themselves realized, I would never do this kind of thing on my own as part of my own personal morality. And the third group were the nominal compliers, people that would obey these orders only as long as an officer or a non-commissioned officer was watching. As soon as they had no one supervise them, they stopped what they were doing. They did not internalize these orders. They did not like what they were doing, but they would do it to avoid confrontation or disciplinary consequences. And as soon as that was not a threat, they stopped doing it. They could not be sent out to do these things on their own. Another concept that emerged in the 1990s was that of cognitive dissonance. And social psychologists argue that basically people often found themselves in a situation where what the values that they held and what they believed in on the one hand were in conflict with what their job required them to do, with how they were supposed to act. Now, whether this was somebody in a corporation who was supposed to be fudging the books to not pay taxes, or some other thing like that, or whether it was Vietnam, there were situations in which people were faced with having as part of their job to act in a way that was in clear conflict with the beliefs as individuals that they brought, beliefs from family, church, education, whatever, that they brought with them beforehand. And the argument in cognitive dissonance was this puts people into a situation of distress. People do not like to be caught in a situation where they are acting in a way contrary to their personal values. And people try to escape from situations of cognitive dissonance. Now, some people will quit their job. They'll tell their boss, stick your job and walk off and do something else. But if you have been drafted into the American Army, or if there is high unemployment and you are supporting your family and paying a mortgage and you don't think you can leave your job, you keep on doing what you're doing. But what can you change? You can change your beliefs. And what turns out is that people will begin to modify what they believe to increasingly be in line with what they are doing. And that they will begin to rationalize what they are doing and to believe in what they are doing. And that we have a case here. If in the case of ideological killers, we have a set of beliefs that determine how people behave, that is a two-way street. We also know there are situations where what people are doing will shape what they believe. And they will adjust their beliefs to the actions that they are carrying out to remove the distress of cognitive dissonance. And this helps us to explain another phenomenon if we go back to the categories of Hamilton and Kelman. That is that there is shift between categories. People who start out as nominal compliers or role players move towards true believers. And that's because over time people will adjust their beliefs. And this is why we can explain what I would call genocidal momentum. People that go to the killing field that initially will be distressed by what they're doing, in a surprisingly short time can become eager killers, can become enthusiastic and inventive about what they are doing. They are transformed by the actions that they are carrying out, by the things that they are witnessing and participating in. Well, these then, I think, are some of the key social psychological concepts that I think help us. None of these alone is the explanation for the grassroots killers. But I think they provide us with a number of insights that help us to make sense of what people were doing. Certainly, when I wrote Ordinary Men, I worked through the 30 volumes of testimony of these 210 reserve policemen, wrote the book, except the conclusion, and then I said, something's missing. I need something more here. I'm not getting everything. And that's when I went back to consult the social psychological literature and wrote the last chapter that I added on. And that this, I think, was for me, I think, crucial to making sense out of what I had empirically discovered. What did I need to understand what I had empirically discovered? Now, there are some people who don't like the use of social psychology in relation to explaining the Holocaust. Some people find it, they argue, and I think they argue falsely, that it is exculpatory, that it is setting up a mechanism. Well, if almost everybody in these circumstances will do it, allegedly those who use this explanation have removed responsibility from them. That somehow we have given an exculpatory explanation. My answer is just the opposite. Every single one of the experiments shows that most people may do something, but some people don't. And if some people don't, every single person in that experiment has made an individual decision. These insights of the experiments may allow us to predict what is the likely proportion and the spectrum over which people will react. None of them tells us how any individual will behave, and we get those proportions only because a whole series of individuals have each made an individual decision as to how they are going to behave. And that means each of them had human responsibility, were engaged in an act of moral decision-making. And I think if these experiments confirm, in fact, that we are talking about moral behavior, not to remove that dimension as some have suggested. I think a more telling critique was that this created a kind of false binary between an ideological explanation on the one hand and the situational and social psychological explanation on the other. And that, I think, is correct. That is a false binary. And in fact, if I were rewriting Ordinary Men today, I think I would have merged my last two chapters. My second to last chapter is basically called Germans, Jews, and Poles, and it deals with the mutual perceptions of the three groups and deals with issues of how Germans understood Poles and Jews in Poland. And I think that key is, in fact, to realize a situation is not a tabula rasa. It is not neutral. People construct the situations they find themselves in. The situation is one that they read through the glasses they are wearing, and they come out of different backgrounds with different values, and they will two different people in the same situation will not understand that situation in the same way. If you take a New Guinea Highlander and put him in front of a scientist in a white coat, that scientist has no authority because he doesn't come out of a scientific culture. And that clearly what the values and cultural assumptions that people bring to a situation will shape how they react to it. And it's that interaction between those two that I think does indeed need to be emphasized. And I separated them in chapters, which I now realize I really should have put together in a larger single chapter that tried to make that point more clearly. And that's something that's come out of the discussion of the 90s that I think was a very valuable part of the response to the book. There are several things about the book, and particularly the empirical claims, that I do think, however, don't require any qualification or retreat. In fact, I think strengthen the position I took. Certainly, in the case of the debate and the argument between me and Daniel Goldhagen, very central to it was the methodological question, excuse me for using the M word, but the methodological question of how do we use perpetrator testimony as historical evidence. Clearly, these people had every motive to lie. They were being investigated for the commission of crimes or for the possibility of being summoned as witnesses against their former buddies. They didn't want to do either of those, and they tried, therefore, of course, to avoid that. Crucial in the German legal definition of murder that separates it from manslaughter. Manslaughter statute of limitations had run. Murder, it still was liable to punishment. Was that the act of killing was committed out of a base motive. And German courts accepted racial hatred, anti-Semitism as a base motive. So that all of these policemen are going to be very careful not to admit to the questioner, to the interrogator, their whatever anti-Semitic attitudes they had earlier. They're going to deny them, disguise them, and so forth. And so both Goldhagen and I realized we were working with very problematic evidence in which you had every motive on the part of the people whose testimonies we were reading to not tell the truth. How do you use such material? Daniel Goldhagen's response was you only use those testimonies that are so self-incriminating that you have no doubt that they're telling the truth. Nobody's incriminating themselves falsely. As he put it, I'm going to use the testimonies of those that basically admit that they gave themselves heart, body, and soul to Adolf Hitler. And if they've confessed to that, then basically we can accept their testimonies as not hiding anything. He said that's what I will use. But I disagreed with that. I think we both agreed we could use that testimony, and we both agreed that the totally, obviously, transparently mendacious testimonies, the ones that are so ridiculous in the kinds of excuses they had that we can dismiss them out of hand, that we would dismiss as well. But I argued there was a middle band of testimony that was not the whole truth, but was part of the truth, and contained so much interesting, valuable material one could not ignore it. Many of the policemen would talk about what the battalion had done, what their company had done, but not what they personally had done. They would admit to things and describe in great detail what had happened, though they wouldn't admit to their own personal involvement. And I thought that material was a goldmine for an historian. And to turn one's back on it was to basically blind oneself. Indeed, I would argue the following, that if your hypothesis is, and this was Goldhagen's hypothesis, if your hypothesis was that virtually every German accepted the cultural assumption of eliminationist anti-Semitism, and therefore believed in the rightness of killing Jews, and the way you're going to test that hypothesis is to look at only the testimonies of those who gave themselves heart, mind, and soul to Hitler, you can only find evidence that confirms the hypothesis it's supposed to test. It can't fail. How convenient. Only if you're willing to take the risk of looking at problematic testimony are you going to find a spectrum of behavior and a nuance be able to nuance, in a sense, what the battalion was doing that is less than a kind of caricature. And so that is where Goldhagen and I differed in the way we use evidence and why we came to such different pictures of what the battalion had done. Now, here is an issue where one can put this to empirical test. Can we find other evidence not involving mendacious reserve policemen giving post-war testimonies that will shed light on several of the key differences in description of what the battalion had done? Two key issues. One was, can people adapt themselves so quickly that people who started the killing process as relatively naive and innocent can become quite brutalized within a short period of time? Cognitive dissonance by changing your beliefs. Is that empirically documentable? And the second was, how broad a spectrum was there in the battalion? He simply announced ex cathedra that there could not possibly have been 10 to 20% of the battalion that didn't shoot because it couldn't have functioned. He provided no evidence for that. He simply announced that as intuitively correct, but without seeing the need to provide evidence. Do we have, by other sources, ways of looking at what was the breakdown among the killers, how many people were the evaders, the non-shooters, and did that in any way cripple the capacity of the killing unit to kill? These can be tested by empirical evidence if we can find those fragments of evidence that are not derived from the post-war police battalion testimonies of themselves. And let me share with you then two examples that shed light on these two issues. The first of these is the issue of spectrum. Is it possible to have a killing unit in which 20% or even more than 20% of the battalion does not kill, but the unit functions perfectly well and continues to be as a killing unit? Let us look at the case of the village of Mir in Belarus. And the account of that comes from a man named Oswald Rufeisen. Now, why is that important? It's important because Oswald Rufeisen is a Jew. Oswald Rufeisen was born in Silesia, spoke fluent German and fluent Polish without a Yiddish accent that immediately revealed the ethnic origins of Jews further to the east. He fled Silesia in 1939 when the Germans came, went to Vilnius. The Germans arrive in Vilnius in 1941. He flees south from Vilnius into what is now Belarus. He comes to the village of Mir, where the Belarusian police captain, collaborator with the Germans, a man named Simeon Serafimovich, intercepts him and asks him for his documentation. And Oswald Rufeisen says, "I've lost my documentation," but then goes on to explain he was a man of Polish-German ancestry, split parentage, a mixed marriage of Pole and German, and therefore he spoke perfect German and Polish, which he could, so it gave it plausibility. And Serafimovich said, well, that's very convenient because I need a translator because the Germans are coming and there's going to be a police unit stationed here and I don't speak very good German, so I have to have somebody who can translate from my Polish to German. So Rufeisen is brought home to sleep in the house of the police captain, a Belarusian police captain of Mir. The Germans arrive, 13 German gendarmerie. These are reserve police, middle-aged, North German, exactly the same profile of the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101, commanded by Sergeant Hein. Sergeant Hein meets with Serafimovich, listens to this very fluent German-speaking 17-year-old boy, and says, I need a translator. You're going to come work for me. So Oswald Rufeisen, at night, sleeps in the house of Serafimovich, and in the day sits at the right hand of Sergeant Hein, conducts all of his business with the native Belarusian, Polish-speaking people, and eats his meals with Sergeant Hein, who becomes extremely fond of him. It's kind of a Europa scenario, practically. And this goes on for 8 months. So Rufeisen has as close an inside look at the dynamics of a group of reserve police as one could possibly ask. Moreover, we have the documented proof of his remarkable memory. He gave his own account to Helmutek, who wrote a book about him, and other things. I myself met him when we were both witnesses at the Serafimovich investigation pre-trial hearing in England, and then I interviewed him in Haifa shortly before he died. But in the course of the opening of the East European archives, the archive at Brest-Litovsk also contained the reports of Sergeant Hein, which told in extraordinarily coincident detail exactly the same story that Rufeisen did. It's an historian's dream to hear one account here and then be able to compare it with a written document from 40, 50 years earlier and see how closely they are congruent. What does Rufeisen tell us about the internal dynamics of the German reserve police in Mir? Well, first of all, he says out of the 13, 4 of them were eager killers. 4 of them were really the go-getters. And they were led by Corporal Schultz, who he called a beast in the form of a man who kept a notebook in his back pocket to record his growing body count, which had reached 80 by the time Rufeisen bolted and escaped, and 3 others that were in his gang, in effect. In addition, there were 5 men who he called the passive executioners of orders, followed standard operating procedure, and there were 4 people, 4 out of 13, that did not take part in the killing of Jews. They would take part in other actions, in the partisan actions, but they did not take part in the Jewish actions, including Sergeant Hein himself, who basically sent Schultz off to do the Jew killing, but he would not take part in that personally. Let me quote from you some of Rufeisen's account. As for the 4 men who did not take part, he says, no one seemed to bother them. No one talked about their absences. It was as if they had a right to abstain. That's how Rufeisen described this dynamic. As for the men in the middle, he says, it was clear that there were differences in their outlook. I think that the whole business of anti-Jewish moves, the business of Jewish extermination, they considered unclean. For them, a confrontation with the partisans was a battle, a military move. But a move against the Jews was something they might have experienced as dirty. And they would come home and they celebrate after a partisan battle. They would come home quite depressed after massacring Jews. So this is an outlook, as I say, from a Jewish witness from inside, and he confirms exactly the tripart division between eager killers, standard operating procedure, and evaders that I have portrayed in Police Battalion 101. Let's look again at the issue of how quickly people can change, be transformed by what they are doing and what they are seeing. Here we have a sequence of letters by a reserve policeman from Reserve Police Battalion 105, which was a sister battalion from Bremen, not Hamburg, but in the very same area, very similar, that was sent into Lithuania and the Baltic in the summer of 1941. And the middle-aged small businessman who was in the battalion, in one of the companies, took on the job of being the company photographer. So he is running around trying to sort of document what's going on. But he writes very frequently to his wife, and by a stroke of luck for historians, the whole sequence of letters that he writes home has survived. On the night before the invasion, this is now late June, when all the units who are going to go into the Soviet Union are given orally the so-called criminal orders. That is, the Commissar Befehl to shoot communist functionaries and the regulations for the guidelines for the troop behavior, which stipulates that they will shoot saboteurs and all sorts of other categories, and Jews, and all of this. These things are read out, but they're not spread, on paper, because some of them fall into the hands of the Soviets or captured. Of course, then that would not be convenient. How does he react to hearing the oral presentation of the criminal orders? Earlier the battalion had been stationed in Norway, which is a pretty cushy deal if you're in the German military. You would like to be stationed in Norway for the war. They've now been sent to the Eastern Front. And so he writes to his wife, "The major said that every suspect is to be shot immediately." Well, I'm in suspense. He doesn't believe it. He thinks that they're grandstanding. And then he goes on to talk about referring to the comfort of the officers' casino in Oslo, and, quote, "The gentlemen fancy themselves as very important and martial." He's telling his wife these people are putting on a self-important act. Within a week, they are into Lithuania, and then he's writing back to his wife that basically he and his comrade have gotten a room in a house where they have Jewish servants and teenagers that will clean for them. As he puts it, quote, "The Jews are free game. Anybody can seize one on the streets for himself." But he then goes on to say that the Jews have no food. Nobody's selling food in the stores to Jews anymore. Quote, "How they actually live, I don't know. We give them our bread and more. I cannot be so tough." This is the second week now, early July. And then for the next month, they move deeper into Lithuania. And then, of course, by late July, early August is when the mass killing begins. And early August, he writes home August 7th, in fact. First of all, he writes about all the things he's looted that he's sending back. The care package that is coming both for his mother and for his wife. Hopes that it all tastes very good. Followed by, quote, "Here all the Jews are being shot. Everywhere such actions are underway. Yesterday night, 150 Jews from this place were shot. Men, women, children, all killed. The Jews are being totally exterminated." He then advises his wife, quote, not to think about it. Kind of fatalistic it must be. And then he goes on to say nothing about it to the daughter. This is part of the letter home that you're not going to read to the children. So this is not triumphal. This is not celebratory. You can detect certain shame in this. And we detect here what is very clear in the post-war accounts, but now it's already here in the summer of 1941. That's what I call the anonymous passive. That all of this is accounted, not I did this, we did this, but here the Jews are being shot. Who's shooting? Jews are just being shot. I mean, this is just like, there was an earthquake that swallowed them up. I mean, it's like it was an act of nature with no author. There's no agency for this. It's just something that has happened. And it must be kind of fatalistic acceptance of it. As they move in further, they begin to encounter resistance behind the lines, partisan ambushes. And he begins to refer to the Russians as, quote, beasts, dogs, trash. Then when some of them are caught, there's an execution. He writes his wife that he had missed it. He wasn't there to photograph it. Quote, "It was said to have been fun." Then we go on as by September, of course, you're getting mass dying in the POW camps. He's been looting up to this point, and now the scorched earth policy of the Russian army, he has no more care package to send home. His response is, for that, their own prisoners must go hungry, the scorched earth, and why he can't send packages. When one sees a prisoner camp, one can see miserable scenes. The people would be better off dead. Well, they very soon were dead. He then goes on that when one of their company is shot, he says his comrades became angry and, quote, would like best of all to shoot down all Russians. A genocidal wish. And then finally he does get his chance. He films an execution. And this time he writes to his family, "In the future, my film will be a document and of great interest to our children." Now this takes place between late June and late September. This man is totally transformed by what he is seeing and what he is doing. He's been brutalized in an extraordinary way, and you can just see it as his words and his language change. So it is possible for people to be changed by what they see and they do. This guy comes into this as a seemingly totally normal, innocent, middle-aged businessman, and by September he is filming executioners, so his children can be edified by the scene. Let me turn to one other thing to add just before we end, and that is the degree to which we can illuminate this question by looking at other genocides. Now, this whole issue of comparison, for a while I would say Holocaust scholars went one way and the scholars of other genocides went the other, and we didn't talk to each other too much. But I think now we're beginning to understand that genocide scholars who take advantage of the insights gained in the study of Holocaust and Holocaust scholars can learn from things that happen elsewhere. This can be mutually reinforcing and provide insights in the sense in both directions. It was my great privilege in one of the 2 years I was a visiting scholar at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to be there when a fellow at the museum was a psychiatrist from Rwanda in the year 2002-2003, a man named Athanaza Hagengamana. And in his background, he was of mixed parentage, a Tutsi parent and a Hutu parent. He had 6 sisters. One had been killed as a Tutsi. One was in jail as a Hutu genocidaire. I mean, this is a family just split right down the middle. When he first survived genocide and decided he must use his psychiatric abilities to help the traumatized survivors, worked with the survivors, and then realized that here was an opportunity to bring his expertise also to the issue of the perpetrators, and asked permission to have access to the prisons where the genocidaires were being held. And he invented 2, what he called instruments. I guess that's the word that psychiatrists use. And the first of these was a self-reporting survey that he sent it out to all of the prisoners, and they were to self-report on the intensity of their involvement in the killing. Strictly voluntary. Now, clearly, some people who were deeply implicated lied on their things and said they weren't. But it's hard to believe anybody who was a self-confessed, deeply involved genocidaire, made that up when they hadn't been. So he had, I would say, an uncontaminated pool, even if it wasn't a comprehensive pool, a statistically sufficient pool of people who all admitted that they had been deeply involved in killing during the Rwanda genocide. He then gave to those people a second instrument, in which he tried to think up all the kinds of questions that would reveal the motivation of these grassroots killers, these face-to-face killers. These are the machete swingers, and what motivated them to do what they did. And he said the results that came back were astounding to him because they didn't parallel any kind of psychiatric survey he had ever given before. And that is, most of the questions, there was simply a flat line, no correlation at all. But on 2 clusters of questions, the correlation simply spiked off the charts. So you simply have something like this, boom, and like that. I mean, this is unusual to have such clarity in this kind of investigation. And the first set of questions, which spiked off the chart, had to do with, basically, we would now say, the ideological framing of what they were doing, the capacity to dehumanize the victims, to view the victims of the genocide as other than human, that they were cockroaches, they were vermin, they weren't human beings, that they were not engaged in the act of murder, they were engaged in an act of sanitation and disinfection, and that they could frame that for themselves and shape what they were doing in those ideological terms. The second area in which things spiked off the chart were all of those questions that related to how concerned they were about how they were viewed and esteemed in the eyes of their comrades. Were they viewed as a worthy comrade? Were they viewed as someone who did their share? Were they reviewed as tough? Were they reviewed as exemplary and a model? And that in this area, you had, again, off the chart in terms of the hardcore killers very much wanting to be made sure, very concerned that everybody recognized them as an exemplary genocidal killer, doing their share, leading the way, and not letting their comrades down. And when I heard him give that presentation, needless to say, I was tremendously struck by the similarity with Reserve Police Battalion 101. There may be many aspects of the Holocaust that we might call unique, if we're careful with not turning that word into kind of an ideological cleaver. But there are also many areas in which I think there are considerable similarities. And certainly the lesson I would take away from Hagengamana's research is that when it gets to the motivation of the grassroots killers, this is much more a universal phenomenon. We do know that virtually every regime that has wanted to commit genocide has not failed for the lack of willing executioners. That is never the bottleneck. Finding people to kill is not the bottleneck. If genocide does not take place, it's stopped in some other way. And that, therefore, I think I would argue that, indeed, both in Rwanda and in Nazi Germany, looking at the grassroots killers, we can see the crucial importance not only of ideology, but also of group dynamics, of the situational factors, that the internal relationships between men in the killing battalions. Thank you very much. Surely.
We've still got about 15 minutes to take questions if anybody would like to ask one.
Yeah, Mr. Stanford, that guy that wrote that letter was very, very fortunate that the military censors didn't catch him, because I would say he perhaps put in a penal battalion, perhaps a concentration camp, because it's totally forbidden by Hitler for anyone to write. And the second part, if I may, bring up about Pol Pot. We're talking about that would be, I would say, very close to the Jewish Holocaust. Considering that Pol Pot had no trains, no German brains, no gas chambers, I believe 2 million. So that's another aspect that perhaps you might like to perhaps touch a little bit on here now. What caused them to kill? And they've done a very efficient job.
Yeah, well, part of our problem in this is, of course, we have not been able to investigate many of the killers of various genocides. Rwanda is one where we are getting in very quickly, and we have been able to do it. Pol Pot's regime, of course, remained almost impossible to get into Cambodia, investigate until the 1990s, late 90s, and even then preparing the trials. There were so many people implicated that many Cambodians didn't even want even a trial, much less a deep investigation of this. So that among various genocides, the Pol Pot genocide remains one of the lesser known in terms of explaining the internal dynamics, particularly of the killing units. We do know more about the ideological pronouncements of the regime and the sequence and geography of it, because that we could trace from refugees, escapees. But the internal dynamics of the killing units is an area for Pol Pot that's really difficult. Now, in terms of the letter writing, we have the fact that Himmler and Heydrich repeatedly, for instance, said, "Don't take pictures and send them home," means that people continue to do it. That here is an area where the writing and photographing of these events was so widespread that the endless orders not to do it just apparently went off people's back like water. And I don't know of anybody who got seriously disciplined for it. First of all, you'd have to have commanders who had nothing else to do but read their post all day, and so I think it was very much a spot check, and almost everybody assumed that their letters could go through. So what would have happened if somebody had read it, I don't know, but my guess is they sort of winked and nodded at most of this.
You referred to recent access to East German archives. There's been increasing access to Russian wells. Books have come out like Hitler and Stalin, Parallel Lives. Now, from what the recent findings, have you thought of revising writing to that point?
No. What we're finding out of the Soviet Union is, say, in contrast to Hitler, who was not a micromanager, Stalin was a micromanager and actually signed death lists. He was very much involved in approving the different particular executions. But of course, these were executions of Soviet citizens. And many of them, of course, nobody killed more communists than Joe Stalin. Many of them were, of course, his own party comrades. So he had to be much more involved, at least in the party purges. He obviously isn't worrying about which of the 3 million Ukrainians is starving and who isn't, or something like that. So I would say we've learned a lot about Soviet crimes, but again, for the dynamics at the local level, and the people who say were the killers at the various prisons, or who carried out massacres like Katyn, we don't have that much information. And there were no trials. Most of what we know about the Germans does not come from written documents, because they talk about policy and report on what happened, but it is the trials and the speaking with the people themselves with subpoena power that I could work, say, on 101. We have no parallel Soviet investigation, interrogation of former killers that would provide us with that kind of database. So it's still, even despite the fact that Soviet archives are now open, those tells us some things, but it hasn't got us what we can now find out about Rwanda and what we now can find out about the Holocaust. Even less so, say, in Mao's China.
Could you comment on Hannah Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil?
Yes, I would be happy to. Let me make two comments about the book. The first of the term banality of evil. This does not mean she considered the evil of the Holocaust to be trivial or banal. She said that the great challenge of the Holocaust was to understand the chasm between the ordinariness of most of the killers and the extraordinary evil they produced. A chasm that can only be crossed by understanding the banality of evil. The terrible evil can be committed by very banal people. There is no symmetry between the perpetrators and the damage they cause. And that's what she meant by the term banality of evil. That was often misunderstood to claim that she was trivializing the Holocaust. And I think that was just a deep misunderstanding. As for Eichmann, I think, basically Eichmann's defense strategy was to pretend he was not one of the ideological killers, but he was one of the mid-level functionaries. And to hide behind that, and to claim he was simply one little cog in the machine, and most of what he tried to do was bungled by others, and his life was a kind of tale of self-pity in his portrayal in his interrogations in Jerusalem. And because Hannah Arendt had helped us to understand the importance of those mid-level functionaries, she was susceptible to being fooled by his self-representation in court, and she bought in. What she got wrong was that Eichmann was one of the ideological killers. She had the right concept in the wrong person. And that her concept about the importance of these middle echelon, ordinary people for totalitarian regimes, I think was quite insightful at the time, early 50s, when she first wrote Origins of Totalitarianism, and then helped to transport that idea into her report on the Eichmann trial. But in terms of understanding Eichmann, I think she just blew it. Way in the back.
We know that there was a substantial return of people who were in the judiciary pre-war into positions, particularly under Adenauer, post-war. Have you done any research into the law enforcement people that you had to deal with in the police battalion and their sort of post-war resurrection?
Yes, certainly since I've worked in many different German court records, one of the things I constantly face is the people who prepare those trials are young post-war Germans who have accepted that as a career, which is not going to get them moved up to the high ends of the legal profession. They do it because they believe in what they're doing. They're very sincere. They're very able. They're extraordinarily hardworking. And in general, most of the cases are very well prepared. As I say, 101, without the two investigators that did that, I would never have had my 210 men and their multiple testimonies. They would bring people back and confront conflicting testimonies. They did a superb job of conducting the investigation. The problem is that when you then get to trial, that the judges who sit are older, and that after the war, there were so few non-Nazis in the legal profession, which was one of the most Nazified professions in Germany, that for every non-Nazi judge that came in, basically you could hire 3 Nazi judges. You had to at least get 25% that weren't all Nazis. And that, of course, meant that your odds of getting a judge who was not terribly conflicted in the trial that he was conducting were pretty low. And therefore you get these cases where superbly prepared cases are kicked out on technicalities, if they're convictions, they're given absurdly low sentences. Reading many German judgments, you get this schizophrenic difference between a superbly empirically prepared research and a dismal legal conclusion in the same document. And that, I think, traces back to the fact that not only was German law difficult to work with, because they didn't use crimes against humanity. That was a allied ex post facto law, they claimed. So they used the 1940 German Criminal Code, which was a very blunt instrument. It was not a definition of murder that was easily applied to or workable for state-organized massacres. So they had a blunt legal instrument, and then you had judges who were generally, in the preponderance, unsympathetic. The most graphic case was the one in which I wrote my last book about, Remembering Survival, in which the police captain of Strakowice which is the town I was studying, the labor camps there, was totally acquitted. And this is acquittal in a case in which you had dozens of Jewish witnesses. And he simply dismissed the testimony of every single one, disparaged them in court, and declared that given there was no reliable testimony to contradict the most absurdly unbelievable account that the defendant himself had given, he declared him acquitted and walked out of the court with his police pension intact. That was a case where I decided I had to look at who this judge was. I looked in the Nazi Party files, and he wasn't there. In fact, I found he had been appointed a judge by the British in Bremen in January of 1946, one of the first clean judges because he didn't have a Nazi record. And then I Googled him, and in the 1960s, in two cases on the bench where German judges can be much more involved in the cross-examination than American judges, he had in fact scolded two German women in court for having sexual relations with Turks. Rassenschande in the 1960s. I mean, this was just terribly bizarre. So here I had this strange combination of somebody who had an absolutely clean record in 1946, talking like a totally unreconstructed Nazi in the 1960s, and then disparaging Jewish witnesses in 1972. And on a hunch, I went and looked through the index for SS officers, and his name came up. And I went to the file on the microfilm in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and unlike most of these files, which are quite thick because they involve all of their family trees and all their disciplinary hearings and all of this, this was virtually empty. There was 3 small pieces of paper in it. The first of these said that his file had come back from the Reichszippanamt. This is the German agency for the investigation of ancestry. Secondly, that the file was empty because that file had now been sent on to the safe of the chief of staff. And the third little note simply said that Erhard, that was the name of the judge, Erhard's application for SS membership had been rejected because of his non-Aryan ancestry. Some Jew has sneaked into his family tree and he never forgave them. So, I mean, there are lots of ways in which you can look at the German judges, and that there's a combination of a difficult law and many of them with very compromised backgrounds.
Was it only a perception of military necessity that enabled the Nazi ideologues to confer honorary Aryan status on Semitic Arabs and Asian Japanese, whilst exterminating Jews, many of whom had contributed very significantly to Germany?
I would say with the Japanese, there was an admiration for the Japanese because they were so good militarily.
But they were Aryan.
They're not Aryan, but they seem to be the Asians who are the most Aryan-like. And that's, I in fact have a student who's done an extraordinary dissertation on the cultural perceptions mutually of Germans of Japanese and Japanese of Germans in the 1930s. And what's filling German theaters and the newsreels is a tough, excellent Japanese army winning in Manchukuo in China, portraying these people as crack military types. These are not an inferior non-Aryan race. These are the Aryans of Asia, in effect. And so that they basically had an admiration for the Japanese. The issue with Arabs, that is a little bit harder to justify. Obviously, they clearly saw the chance of stirring up Arabs against the British control in the East, intended to do that, made promises to them. Of course, the Arabs have been promised all sorts of things in World War I. Everybody has promised the Arabs in the Middle East things that they didn't intend to keep, whether it be the Balfour Declaration or Hitler's promises. He had no territorial ambitions in the Middle East. Yeah. That's another issue. Okay.
But many of the Jews could have been, this might sound callous, but many of those Jews who were sent to their deaths could have been exploited by the Germans to advance their own objectives, and yet they were either expelled, most of them were exterminated.
Yes, certainly one of the key debates that continues to go on in the German government is, how few or how many Jews do you keep for labor in an era of tremendous labor shortage. Himmler fanatically trying to destroy entire labor camps, and others trying to preserve a small remnant of Jewish labor. Those often chased out. But I mean, certainly there's a contradiction, but the fact is Hitler's really obsessed about Jews, not about Semites. And anti-Semitism is a term that was applied in the late 1860s or 70s by Wilhelm Marr to explain that we didn't oppose Jews because of religion. We opposed them because of their race. And he's not thinking of Arabs at all. So it was basically a term to designate a non-religiously justified hatred of Jews. So on that understanding, Arabs don't even come into the picture.
Okay, we'll take two more questions, one there, one here. Thank you.
I would like you to comment further on the historical specificity of the Holocaust. I was particularly interested in your comments on social psychology because historians generally find social psychology quite universalizing. They're skeptical of its possibilities because it leads to these concepts like human nature, which they see as completely, like specificity in that concept, if they're skeptical of that. And what I'm interested in is how you have discerned the specificities of the Holocaust using that methodology.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I think that earlier in my career there was a long period of debate. Is the Holocaust unique? And I thought it was framed in a very unfruitful way. It was a kind of competitive victimization rivalry in which I didn't think was very profitable. The ways in which I think the Holocaust is the particularities of the Holocaust that identify and separate it from other genocides, I would say. One is the degree to which this harnessed the modern state and the scientific and technological capacities of the modern state. Secondly, the degree to which it targeted an entire continent, not just the people within a particular country. And thirdly, the disparity between the allegations made against Jews and the reality of their harmlessness. As many genocides come out of prior conflicts that are real conflicts. Hutus and Tutsis had, we can say it was started by the Belgians who put these false terms on them, but in Rwanda and Burundi there have been conflicts, just as in Turkey there had been, in the Ottoman Empire there had been conflicts with Armenians and Turks, and there had been real conflicts of different kinds. It is very difficult to understand any real conflict, between Germans and a 2-year-old Ukrainian Jewish girl that requires her brains to be blown out at point-blank range. This is a fantasy. The Germans are combating a totally made-up, fantastical threat. In that sense, I think among genocides, this is maybe the most fantastically driven one. And so I would say that distinguishes it. They're not killing Jews for territory. They're not killing Jews for wealth. They're killing them to eliminate a totally imaginary threat. Now, having said that, I think that there are also many ways in which the genocide is a genocide. It fits under the rubric of genocide. And in particular, as I say, the dynamics of killing units, I think, is not going to separate genocides significantly. And certainly, genocides learn from one another, and that the degree to which you're going to categorize and label people in a more systematic way now, whether it's just a character of the 20th century or the fact one's modeling oneself after the Germans, but I think it's quite fair to say that the Holocaust is a genocide among genocides, even if it has particularly some identifying characteristics. Now, to the degree to which I universalize, I say yes. I don't think we can talk about historical events unless we don't talk about them in comparison with and accept both similarities and differences. And if similarities is universalization, one can use that term, but I think it's part of how we understand what happened.
Anna?
I not long ago received a YouTube called March of Life, I think, which was a group of descendants of perpetrators, major SS people, who were taking on themselves the guilt of what their parents had done, or their fathers or grandfathers had done, and were going to the various concentration camps, the Sinikis and whatever. They've all got testimonies of what their parents and grandparents had done. Is anybody looking into documenting those and collating those, do you think?
I believe there is someone who is looking into second generation, third generation of the perpetrators. But I don't know who that is. I mean, I've
Baron and Wagner.
but certainly an Israeli, but there's also a German too, isn't there?
Gottfried Wagner, the grandson of Richard, and the Israeli Dan Baron.
Yeah.
They have that kind of.
Yeah. So there is some work in that. I mean, you have I would say, I guess you have a group that as you say, still sort of carries the guilt. You have some that are unreconstructed and either justify or deny what their parents have done. And you have a large number who have basically been filled with and kind of bought into the self-pity narrative of the perpetrators. When I read through the reams of Testimony 101, the overwhelming attitude of the perpetrators is not remorse, it's not pride, it's self-pity. How unfortunate I was at that time to be assigned to that unit to do those terrible things, and how doubly unfortunate I am that they changed the rules since, and now I'm in a courtroom being tried for that. Poor me. Never anything about the victims, but it is overwhelming self-pity for themselves.
Were they also not congratulated for staying human? 101. They were actually awarded and rewarded.
Well, Himmler makes that famous Posen speech in which he's playing exactly to that mentality that you've done this great historic and difficult task, but remain decent. And that's sort of one of his ways of understanding, in fact, the psychological needs of his killers.
Mr. Browning, on behalf of the whole audience, which comprises a number of Holocaust survivors are here today, we have museum members, we have museum guides, museum staff members, a number of students from Sydney University, and a number of other people. I want to thank you. It's been a privilege for all of us to hear a most fascinating talk by a world-renowned Holocaust historian. So thank you very much.
Thank you.